It's the Wonkhe Show. We've cleared the schedule, we've made some room. This week it's all about the regulator. It's definitely a reportable event. It's all coming up.
How do you decide what's risky? Is a provider inherently risky because it's small, or is it inherently risky because of the sorts of students it recruits, or is it risky because it's not doing its processes properly to produce the outcomes that are desirable, or it's not able to articulate that? And that's a bit of a journey, I think.
Welcome to a special edition of The Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into higher education, policy, people and politics. I'm Rachel Firth, and this week the Office for Students, England's higher education regulator, have published their registration process and outcomes for 2019-20. And before you could say 600-word blog, Team Wonkhe were going through the document, and there is a lot in there to discuss, so we are recording this special episode to take you through the key themes and points of interest. As this is a special episode, we have broken from tradition, and we have two of Team Wonkhe here to discuss the key themes and the outcomes, and we're going to serve you up that lovely analysis that I know you all love. So we've got Wonkhe's editor, Debbie McVitty. Hello, Debbie.
Hi, Rachel.
And we have Wonkhe's associate editor, Mr. Jim Dickinson. Hello, Jim.
Hello.
Hello. Right. Let's get straight into this. The new figures from the Office for Students, or OfS, have been published in an analysis of its registration process. So, Jim, give us the overview of this one, please.
Okie dokie, yes. So, before the dawn of all time, when David Willetts was Higher Education Minister and there was no prospect of legislation, a bunch of bodies were brought together to form a kind of committee to work out what regulation there was and what there wasn't. And after about 2 years, everybody worked out that there were massive holes in the regulatory process as you shifted from the idea of a sort of funder to the idea of students paying with their tuition fee loan vouchers. And so the Higher Education and Research Act, steered through Parliament then by Joe Johnson, created a regulator that we've all come to know and love called the Office for Students. And 1 year into the initial provider registration process, the idea was that once everyone that had initially applied tumbled onto the register, we would get a report into what had happened in that initial process. And that initial process was supposed to test a bunch of the regulatory conditions to sort of work out whether or not people had made it on, and if they were under closer scrutiny as a result of just about making it on. That process has turned out to be a bit late for all sorts of reasons. Providers would say that some of the requirements have been very difficult to understand and that they've had difficulty interacting with the registration team in Bristol. OfS would say, well, lots of people's applications were incomplete and lots of people didn't do as they were told in the guidance. But whichever end you believe, and I suspect it's a bit of a mixture of the two, OfS was unable to hit its sort of initial this August the 1st deadline to get everyone on the register. And so now a couple of months late, really, and even with some people having applied to register not having had decisions yet, we now have a report that tells us what has gone on in year one. Now, what OfS is really keen to stress in the sort of press release that sort of covers this report today is that it has taken a whole bunch of action in relation to a range of things. So access and participation is a theme, other issues to do with student outcomes, and a whole bunch of things to do with sort of management, leadership and governance. And we'll talk about those at least briefly when we dive in shortly. But what it's done is it has summarised in this report big themes that have come out of that initial assessment process, and also summarise some of the stats around its interventions. And its interventions, which we cheekily described on the site the other week as sort of provisional, bronze, silver and gold interventions, can range from getting a letter through to being under enhanced monitoring, through to a sort of public condition of registration, through to not being allowed on the register at all. And fining is in there too, and we have some stats. And broadly, there's barely a provider, big or small, established or challenger, that hasn't had some kind of regulation thrown at it. And I guess fairly frustratingly, what we don't know, because OfS tends to treat all of the providers on a level playing field and as if they're kind of all the same, we don't know where they focus on some themes, whether that's old universities, newer universities, challenger providers, FE colleges, and so on, except in a few cases. So we just have headline stats. And as I say, the big story is, the story OfS wants us to hear is, it has taken tough action in relation to a whole range of things.
Debbie, what's your hot take on it? It's what do you think the OfS's kind of messages are in this?
Well, there is. I mean, this effort to say we're coming down very strongly, and of course most of this doesn't make it through to the public register, so we only know where providers are under enhanced monitoring conditions. We don't know if, for example, they've been asked to rewrite their student protection plan 3 times and that sort of thing. And you could arguably say that that's reasonable. The areas where there's been quite a lot of extra activity in terms of asking providers to resubmit, or sending them letters saying we need this from you on an ongoing basis, or we want you to complete an improvement plan and look at it again, are in access and participation, in quality and particularly student outcomes, and in governance and management and governance. These appear to be the areas that OfS has identified as being weak. But I think, when you look at the tone of this report, you really have to apply some pinches of salt here, because there is this sense, I think, that we're either talking about, and this is where Jim's point about not knowing which providers we're talking about, because it is the report is written as if OfS was surprised to discover that providers in general don't seem to know how to make a submission to the regulator, and they have fallen very short of
having never done it before
of the quality standards expected. And I think and providers have sort of said, well, look, we've asked for guidance. The guidance we've been given, we've not necessarily been able to make exact sense of it, and we've kind of and I don't know whether providers have said, we'll just sling in all the stuff we used to do anyway and see what happens, or whether they've kind of made honest efforts in the most cases to try and comply with the guidance, but then fallen short against standards that were never kind of fully articulated in the first place, or whether actually what we're talking about is most providers being doing fine, but newer providers who particularly aren't used to this sort of regulation, and maybe kind of doing this thing very much from the ground up with very small teams. Without knowing that, it's very hard to know what's really gone on here.
I think, wasn't there a quote in the document which was, a number of providers were not ready to be regulated?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting because, it's a bit like when you throw exams at students, right? So there's a debate about whether or not you're testing innate talent or whether you're testing what they've learned. Right. And then there's a debate about whether or not people can learn how to do well in exams. And so whether you're testing either of those things is different to whether you're testing people's just ability to do exams. So if you think about this, in some cases, providers might have been, innately really good at all of the things that have emerged as the standards, the sort of baseline standards. In other cases, providers might say, if you told us what the baseline standards were and gave us a bit of time, we would hit those standards. And then in other cases, actually, the report appears to critique people's ability to write up what they're doing and express it well, rather than actually testing either of those things. And in the end, any regulator, I guess, has got this really kind of tough set of questions to ask about how it regulates, how it finds things out, what evidence it requires, how clear it needs to be about what the requirements are, and so on and so on. And certainly, in a minute or two, we'll come on to some of the debates, I guess, about what the baseline standards really are.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of things about saying, well, you said that you were compliant with the law, but you didn't explain how you knew you were compliant with the law, and you sort of think, okay, well, and anyone who's, I guess, been heavily involved in academic quality, who's been a registrar, who's got a kind of legalistic mind, which, of course, many providers, you need those sorts of people on staff, and there are probably lots of accountable officers with those sorts of skills. But if you're not used to thinking in that way, it's a very specific way of thinking, and it's saying we publish information to students, and sort of saying, yes, but how do you know that the information you published to students is like, well, because I can see it with my eyes on our website. I don't know what else to tell you. You know, if you approach this as a sort of from a common sense perspective, I think you may have fallen foul of the OfS's expectations.
So why don't we talk about students for a bit, Jim? What does the report tell us about things like outcomes, student protections, value for money, etc.?
Yeah, so there's two big categories really of findings, and one of the categories I guess we would kind of swedge into what we might call students and their outcomes, and we've put a bit of detail up on the site this morning about some of the things that are in the report. To summarise as kind of tightly as possible, followers of this will recall that it took a while for OfS to agree that the UK Quality Code should form the basis of their kind of sets of judgments about positive outcomes for students. And what they've done is kind of riff off bits of the quality code that relate to kind of student outcomes, and they've picked three big indicators. So student continuation and completion indicators, so that's the kind of raw stats of the people who complete and continue when it's a multi-year course. Other outcomes, and in particular outcomes for students with different characteristics, so degree outcomes and so on, particularly where there are differentials between student groups and graduate employment and so on. Now, I guess the big controversy here is B3. And what B3 looks at is principally continuation rates and then progression into further employment and so on. And OfS has got a bunch of data. And the reason this has been controversial is it's cropped up a few times in formal public conditions of registration. We hear on the rumour mill it's cropped up in a whole number of times in enhanced monitoring, and it's definitely cropped up in registration refusals. So in other words, this thing about we expect providers to produce outcomes for students is pretty big and pretty controversial. And the reason it's controversial is that until today, we've not known what the minimum is that you have to achieve. So the official OfS position is you have to deliver positive outcomes for all students, but obviously back here in the real world, the idea isn't that literally every student gets a positive outcome, but you do have to be attempting to deliver positive outcomes, but no one has known what the minimums are. Now, I say today, when we're recording this, we haven't seen the minimums, although they've promised to publish them by the time this podcast goes live. And throughout the course of the next few days, we'll try and dive into that. But what is clear is that one of the things that OfS have said is, if 75% of your students as a provider are getting outcomes that are of concern, that would trigger all sorts of interventions from OfS. And the trouble with that, I think, is that significantly favours a really big provider that can, I'm not saying they do it on purpose, but that have got sufficient numbers of students such that the averages mean that you can have a large number of students not achieving some of those basics, but you can balance that with other types of provision. If, on the other hand, you're a really small provider, a local FE college only doing WP work, where with all the will in the world, it's actually quite tough, even if you're doing really good things to get people to complete, that might be much, 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 much harder to, secure those outcomes. And there's two ways of looking at this, right? Either you can say, look, if you're small, you're focused on WP, you're doing it in a local area, if you're not recruiting students of calibre, you're wasting their time and you're wasting their money. That's a perfectly legitimate point to have. But if the same number of students could be doing it at a large former polytechnic down the road, then what that's about is the same sort of student facing the same sort of risk of not completing, but one provider being told they can't do it and another provider being told they can do it as long as they balance it with a load of other provision. And that seems really odd and is bound to be the kind of source of ire in a whole bunch of the legal casework they've got coming up.
And they do say, we take into account the context and stuff. I suppose the problem is when you're talking about making judgments about data and data thresholds and that sort of thing, combining a number with a sort of impressionistic view is where it always gets a bit tricky, because if there's some point at which you cross the threshold into scrutiny, then the subsequent kind of judgments then become very much open to, very much very, very contestable. So there's a kind of, I guess, a process issue here. and a level playing field issue as well. I think it's also worth picking up some of the other studenty stuff. I mean, one thing is that there's very little additional monitoring around the area of standards. Where I think is really particularly interesting is in this question of student protection plans, because this was identified quite strongly in the report as something that, first of all, very few providers were able to produce something credible. Then when they were told to resubmit, they all produced the same thing, which means that they'd all been talking to each other and saying, let's give them this and see if that works. And the kind of outcome of that is that OfS is said it's going to have to produce new guidance to explain more clearly what should be in a student protection plan. And some of the things they sort of said, this is something that should be kind of accessible and meaningful to students, and it was written, of course, in kind of university policy language. So they sent it back, or it sort of didn't really countenance the idea that an institution might close, so they had to send it back, and it sort of conjures up quite a sort of funny process where they keep sending in and it keeps getting sent back, and they keep adding stuff and sending in again. And keeps getting sent back.
It was 266 providers were asked to resubmit during the process. Quite a figure, that, I thought.
Yeah, and it's funny because if you read between the lines, what it looks like was happening is that before last Christmas, people were being told to resubmit straight away. And then there's a moment at which it looks like OfS basically give up, throw in the towel, and then tell all of them and everyone else that then subsequently it gets onto the register, do you know what? You are going to have to submit, but wait until we've issued new guidance. And one of the really interesting things about that is that until now we've been told that new guidance would emerge this month. This document says that a consultation on new guidance will emerge this month. Now, it could well be that OfS is very keen to consult because it likes listening to voices. On the other hand, we know it has to consult if it revises the regulatory framework itself. And I think my guess would be that given there's a board meeting in January that's due to discuss regulatory framework changes, that we might end up with changes to the regulatory framework on student protection. The other thing I'd say about student protection is the big headlines are that OfS wants to, make sure that there are protection arrangements for students if a course, a campus or an institution closes. Makes lots of sense. But material components was also written into the regulatory framework. And to give you a sense of that, if a big chunk of your course that's all in optional modules gets shut, in theory that would have been covered. And similarly, if your course gets relocated, that's not a course closing or an institution closing or a campus closing, but it is a massive material change. And one of the things this document's totally silent on in the student protection plan section is material components. And I guess one of the really interesting things will be whether or not that level of, at least in theoretical protection for changes to material components of courses, makes it through the next 7 or 8 weeks.
What people are writing plans for is a set of circumstances that, there's a bunch of kind of circumstances that sort of happen all the time, and people still haven't quite got their heads around that students need protection in those situations, and then a whole other bunch of circumstances that barely ever happen, and no one kind of knows what protection would even be available to students in those circumstances because it's never been tested. So, I mean, it is hardly surprising, I think, that this is an area of development. And I think what's kind of strange is that the whole tone of the report, more in sorrow than in anger, implies that people should already know this, And I think there's a sort of version of an evolving regulatory framework where we say, look, this is where we're trying to get to, and we understand it will be an iterative process, and we understand that we're going to need to develop it, and we can do that kind of working together. And of course, that would be the sort of co-regulatory model that was kind of killed off by the Higher Education Research Act.
I have to say though, one of the bits I really like in there is because obviously one of the things that student protection plans are supposed to do is identify the risks to students, particularly big financial risks to the provider. And one of the things it says is, look, folks, we've looked at your SPP, then we've looked at other financial information, and in some of your information that students would never read, it says you're really worried about your finances, not least some FE colleges that are regulated by ESFA and have got big red lights, flashing on their financial dashboards. And then the SPP says, oh, no, it's all going to be fine. Nothing to worry about here, and therefore we're not going to tell you much about what might happen if we collapse.
All right, so a couple of things coming through on management and governance issues. One being OfS discovering that in some cases they're not confident in institutional processes for determining who's a fit and proper person to be a governor. Now, again, it's sort of hard to know what we're talking about here, because if, for example, an institution is relying on governors to self-declare other interests, so they might be sitting on a public committee or be a director of a different company, and they have to, keep that log updated, and in not every case they remember to do that, and that is objectively a problem, but in the overall scheme of things might not be such a big problem. If, however, governors are not declaring interests because those interests are making them not fit and proper to be a governor, then that is a problem. So it's hard to tell what the sort of scale and importance of it is, but it does seem that the sort of fairly relaxed approach to thinking about who's on your governing body and are they fit and proper isn't really meeting OfS's standards in some cases. There's also some quite interesting stuff around freedom of speech. So this is part of a public interest in governance condition, and it's expected all further and higher education providers are supposed to have a policy and code of practice on freedom of speech and academic freedom. And the OfS says in some cases, providers, don't have all the codes and policies in place, and in some cases don't have a sort of really well-grounded understanding of what the difference between those two things is. So, for clarity, academic freedom is about protecting academic research and making sure that there are kind of no consequences to academics in terms of their employment if they take unorthodox views or want to pursue a particular line of research, whereas freedom of speech is about protecting freedom of speech across the whole institution, so that's students and staff and external speakers as well. So it is a slightly different thing, and that doesn't seem in every case to have been kind of well articulated or elaborated how it's being protected. And then in a few cases you get, and particularly the report pinpoints privately owned providers, where that kind of model of governance of some of sort of informed lay people who have a kind of direct responsibility for the institution doesn't really seem to be in place at all. And then you've got kind of a real problem about who's responsible for the institution, and are they able to kind of discharge duties relating to governing bodies, and are they kind of regularly checking their effectiveness as a governing body and that sort of thing. So the whole the development of meaningful governance in perhaps small providers and perhaps privately owned providers seems to be an area for development, shall we say.
Indeed. This was another condition where lots of providers were asked to resubmit as well. There was over 54% of providers were asked to submit additional evidence or clarification because the OfS said they didn't have sufficient information to assess whether the condition was actually satisfied or not, which I thought was interesting. Jim, what stood out for you in this theme, this kind of this governance and management theme?
Well, I mean, just on the freedom of speech stuff. Reading between the lines, what they're saying here is that, there aren't lots of external speakers and, lots of debating societies where there are 30 HE students in a general FE college. Now, I think that's probably right. But what I do think is interesting about that section is that what it doesn't do is really what Joe Johnson and Sam Gema spent a year in the Telegraph promising it would do, which is crack down on snowflakes in the Russell Group. So if you compare the rhetoric, which was my tough new regulator will deal with a mythical freedom of speech problem on campus, with the reality in here, which is, we found a few general FE colleges that, don't have debating society policies. It is really interesting to see how regulation plays out in practice in the end, rather than, in theory. There are a couple of things that I think are fascinating also in this section. One of them is, there's a sort of, actually quite a small line in there that says, governing bodies aren't really testing the assurances they get from academic governance. So obviously in most universities there's this really kind of traditional important split between the corporate governance, the bit that looks after the buildings and the water supply, and then the academic governance, the bit that looks after the courses. But of course, in law and in OfS's eyes, it is University Council or the Board of Governors that's responsible for the whole lot. And the idea is that, you might well say to academic governance, you can look after this, but the Board of Governors or University Council has to test the effectiveness and test the robustness of the stuff it's getting from there. And actually, by the looks of it, what OfS have found when it's scratched at that is, in some cases, just a kind of exchange of minutes from Senate or academic board. And really, OfS is saying that's not good enough. And I think what I'd say about that is that OfS has definitely got to be in its bonnet about governance, quite rightly, I think, in some cases, and we should expect quite a bit more action on that in the next year or so, 18 months.
The other thing I pick up is the CUC code, which is the Committee of University Chairs code, which is referenced in the regulatory framework as being kind of this is your reference point for complying with all the kind of principles of good governance, and you should have due regard to it and that sort of thing. It seems to be implied that providers have said, okay, right, well, we're compliant with the CUC code, and they've said that to various degrees. So in some cases, they've just stated it, and then OfS has come back and said, you haven't told us how, or how you test that, or how you revise that, how you kind of keep track of that. And so they've had to resubmit on that basis. But there's also seems to be an implication that the CUC code doesn't actually cover all of the kind of all of the public interest interest in governance conditions from OfS's perspective. So our understanding is that code is going to be revised, but it may be that one of the reasons providers are subject to enhanced monitoring in relation to that is that code has not been revised. And one of the things that actually is in that code is this regular assurance issued from the Board of Governors on academic quality, and there needs to be a kind of annual return saying, yes, we have assured ourselves of the academic quality, and the kind of the status of that annual return is unclear at present. And the fact that it's in the CUC code is the sort of thing I think that's creating concern. So I think this is maybe what happens when different bits of regulatory bits and pieces get out of alignment. You get lots of enhanced monitoring, and that may just be because people are kind of working off an old version of a code.
And finally, Jim, is there anything else that you kind of popped out at you in this report?
Well, I think the other really big thing is money. So, there have been lots of chunks of time where people have been speculating about the financial health of the sector, and in particular individual providers in the middle of the sort of demographic dip. What OfS finds here is that a few too many, for its liking, providers have got growth projections. In a way, that's nothing new. We sort of knew that from the financial sustainability report it did earlier. And basically what OfS is saying is it hasn't done any public conditions of registration, and it hasn't kind of refused anyone, or at least not in public, refused anyone so far on the basis of their finances, because OfS's calculation is effectively that although everyone's been very optimistic, they would be able to make savings if their numbers didn't come true. But it's clear that a lot of providers are under enhanced monitoring, which is the sort of private version of that, on their numbers, to make sure that governing bodies and universities more generally are on top of their growth forecasts, because, broadly what OfS is saying is there is no way on God's earth you can all be right, which again, is not new, is something we sort of knew before, and again this one is pretty tricky for the regulator, because again this is that issue we've discussed earlier, which is if it was very public about some of its concerns in relation to the finances of providers, you might cause a run on the bank, it might make things worse for those providers and so on. So it does have to do a lot of enhanced monitoring in this space, and certainly it's kind of talking up in the report that it's crawling all over it, even if we can't see where it's crawling and why it's crawling in detail.
And Debbie, finally, is anything from you that we've not covered that popped out at you from the report?
I think for me this idea, and I sort of keep coming back to this, is that by taking this outcomes-based approach, this kind of wave of innovation and kind of diverse approaches to managing risk and kind of doing stuff for students will be unleashed. And it's it's really early days in this new regime, and it's there's still plenty of time for that to happen. And you could argue, which I think OfS sort of consistently has, is that providers are basically kind of hooked on guidance and direction, and need to be weaned off it with some kind of light touch methadone oversight or something. But it's hard for me to see at this point how you get that kind of innovation and creativity being unleashed when the regulator is being so kind of stringent in some ways and unclear in others. I think it is culturally it doesn't seem like a kind of great space for people to be thinking about how can we do this in a new way, because if you don't know what your sort of starting point is, and there isn't kind of evolution of common practice and common understanding from which you might then depart, it becomes very difficult. So I suspect a lot of providers are just sort of looking for the hoop that they should be jumping through, rather than thinking how do we create our own hoops.
That's fabulous.
Yeah, and I think the thing that definitely jumps out at me is that in practice it ain't half hard, to create a level playing field where you're regulating using the same principles and to some extent at least equivalent standards for a theatre company that happens to be delivering some HNCs and HNDs of 40 students and a university of 40,000 students. And it's not to say it's impossible, but when in theory you're trying to apply the similar baseline outcome standards across all of those, it's really, really tough to do that in practice. And one of the things that comes through really clearly in the document, I think, is a kind of ongoing tension between allowing innovation and new providers to kind of set up and fumble and make the odd mistake, but then if you go too far down that road, letting established providers off the hook from some of their weaknesses, in particular in relation to access and participation and so on. And in practice, where you draw that line, either in the creation of the standard or indeed in the application of the standard, is really, really tough, I suspect. And I am as cynical as anybody, probably more cynical than many, when I look at some of the things that are in the report and the way they're framed by OfS. But I think, given the time frame, this is a good stab at focusing on a good set of things that in the end are actually quite important to students, that are enrolled on real courses that have real lives.
I think what you're describing there as well, Jim, is that kind of question about how do you decide what's risky? Is a provider inherently risky because it's small, or is it inherently risky because of the sorts of students it recruits, or is it risky because it's not doing its processes properly to produce the outcomes that are desirable, or it's not able to articulate that? And that's a bit of a journey, I think, that everyone's still going on to kind of understand what it means to make assessment of risk. And that's one of the reasons why having some kind of shared understanding about how you do risk in a way that makes sense to the regulator is going to be, I think, a big question for academic and corporate governance.
Right, well, you heard it here first. Jim is slightly more cynical than most people. Right, so that is about it for this special episode. To follow all the coverage and analysis of the OfS paper, do follow us on Wonkhe.com. You can also have a look at the episode page for this podcast, where you can leave your thoughts and comments. You can always subscribe to this podcast automatically. Just search for The Wonkhe Show on your favourite directory, or you can find the feed that you need on Wonkhe.com/podcast. And if you think you've got what it takes to be a guest on the show, please do drop us an email on team@wonkhe.com and we will be in touch. So thanks again to Jim and to Debbie and everyone at Team Wonkhe for making this very, very quick turnaround getting this podcast out the door. Thank you for listening, and until next week, stay wonky.